Hello and welcome to this ISM Trust webinar on writing a music development plan for secondary and all through schools. I'm Ruth McPherson, Head of Charity Development at the ISM. The ISM Trust is our sister charity, which offers high quality professional development to everyone working in music. Through the Trust, the ISM gives back to the sector and supports and empowers music professionals to succeed. The ISM Trust offers a number of useful free resources for classroom music teachers, including our National Curriculum Framework and Wall Chart for primary and Key Stage 3 teachers, our Primary Music Toolkit, an online toolkit to help teachers bring the curriculum to life, our recently launched Primary Singing Toolkit, a free digital resource for primary music teachers from the ISM Trust and Voices Foundation, and a library of music education webinars covering a wide range of topics, including teaching music to students with SEND. We'll pop the links to some of these resources in the chat, and we'll also send you a list of useful links after the webinar. Before we begin, just a few things to note. During the presentation, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer these at the end. And do keep an eye on the chat box where we'll be dropping in some useful links. If you experience any technical difficulties, let us know in the chat box and we'll attempt to resolve them. And if you wish to use them, subtitles are available to enable at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording with you afterwards, as well as a feedback survey, which we'd be very grateful if you would fill out. This is the second in a series of 2 ISM Trust webinars aimed at music leads who are writing music development plans. These webinars will help you to articulate your music provision and focus your music development plan on inclusive and accessible music education. Today's webinar is aimed at music leads in secondary and all through schools. Before I hand over to our presenters, Sophie Gray and Margaret O'Shea, I'd like to give you some context about music development plans and where this term has come from. This webinar will be relevant to secondary and all through music teachers from across the 4 nations of the UK. However, we will be specifically referring to the recommendation in the refreshed National Plan for Music Education for England, published in June 2022, that every school in England, including multi-academy trusts, should have a music development plan in place by September 2023. The National Plan for England explains that the purpose of a music development plan is to help parents and children understand what they can expect from music education, and suggests that publishing the school music development plan on the school website may help families to understand how their children will benefit from school music. So there is an advocacy element to music development plans, and they can help teachers and schools to demonstrate the value of music. In terms of format, the plan has not been prescriptive about what a music development plan should look like. It just says that schools should produce their music development plan in a form that works for them. And it's also important to highlight that music development plans are non-statutory, so there is no legal requirement to produce one. However, it has been encouraged by the Department for Education. In terms of timeline, the plan recommends that schools have their music development plan in place in time for the beginning of the 2023-2024 academic year, so by September of 2023. The plan states that the music development plan should cover music provision across curriculum, co-curricular and enrichment areas, and across a number of key features, which we'll go into in more detail shortly. Staffing and funding should be considered, along with staff development and training and monitoring success. And schools should consider how you'll work with your music hub, and we'd recommend that you seek input from your music hub when writing your plan, and Sophie will expand a bit more on this later. Schools have also been asked to develop a music progression strategy as part of their music development plan. So this diagram is quite helpful in terms of illustrating how to consider your music development plan within the wider ambition of the National Plan for Music Education. And you can see that at the heart of all music education planning should be children and young people, and then the school music development plan should sit within the Academy Trust plan if relevant, and then that should sit within the regional or hub plan, and then finally the national plan. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to hand over to our presenters, Sophie Gray and Margaret O'Shea. Sophie Gray has been in music education for the past 20 years, working primarily in special schools and alternative provision, and with those with complex disabilities. Sophie's currently Head of Inclusion and Teacher at Services for Education Music Service, and she teaches on the PG Cert in Sounds of Intent. And Margaret O'Shea is an ISM member and the Director of Music for ARC Schools. She's an experienced music teacher, and having been Director of Music for ARC for 5 years, she now leads on their curriculum and enrichment work across all creative, cultural and sporting faculties. So thank you, and over to you, Sophie.
Thank you, Ruth, and hello everybody and welcome. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be talking about inclusion generally, but also in relation to the plans. And I guess it's useful, I think, to start off by saying why inclusion is important. Generally, I would say inclusion is important mostly because of the impact it can have on children and young people. So if we do inclusion well, those who are marginalised, and particularly those with the biggest barriers to learning or access, can have, you know, there can be incredible results from that. And I think all of you as music educators will have seen this happen in your work, you know, how music can be transformational for some young people. For that reason, I believe it should be a human right that all children and young people have access to a high quality music education. So this is why we absolutely should be doing inclusion. We now also have to be doing inclusion, which is great because of the new National Music Education Plan 2. Inclusion is one of the main 5 strategic functions for hubs, and it does run throughout the whole of the plan, inclusion. I put here about raising our profile. I think as an organisation, it's definitely a positive to show that we can do inclusion well. But I also think as individual teachers and as schools as well, it's definitely a sign of quality if we can be truly inclusive. I also believe that inclusion makes us better teachers, better musicians, and arguably better people. I think the world would be a much improved place if people thought more inclusively. And as an organisation, you know, we would like inclusion to be at the heart of everything that we do. I feel like we definitely have lots of work to do to get to that point, but that's our kind of end goal, if you like. And thinking about the development plans themselves, why is inclusion important within those? Because it should be at the heart of everything we do, but also because it's so important to get the planning right with inclusion. And I'll be talking more about that later, but I think that's why it's particularly important for plans, I would say. We all need to be part of shaping this change, and I mean that as us as music educators, but also us just as members of society. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to just have a little think about what inclusion is. It's one of these terms that's used a lot these days, and it can potentially mean different things to different people or different organisations. But this is quite a nice summary, I think, for an organisation, which is that inclusion is the practice or policy of providing equal access to opportunities and resources for people who might otherwise be excluded or marginalised. And the word equal here is good when we're talking about access, but in terms of opportunities, sometimes we need to think about equitable opportunities. So giving the same opportunities to all children and young people might not necessarily be the best way to go. I think it's also really important to be aware of the fact that inclusion doesn't just refer to those with disabilities, it refers to any of those with barriers to learning. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch upon this. Some of you may be aware of intersectionality, some of you may not. But really just to say it's so important to know the young people that we're working with and know potentially what their lived experiences are, or the fact that various forms of inequality can often operate together and exacerbate each other. Next slide, please. And thinking about just us as educators, it's just really important to think about the children in the room and that whole child and what experiences they may have gone through, and also about us as individuals and what our identities are and how this might colour our responses or our relationships within our classrooms as well. Next slide, please. I'm sure I don't need to tell any of you this, but inclusion is not just for special schools or alternative provision settings, it's vitally important for everybody. Next slide, please. So hopefully this kind of underpins that. So this is the most recent statistics from the DfE, which are that just under 1.5 million pupils in England have special educational needs, and that can be those with EHC plans and those who just have SEN support. The most common type of need for those with an EHC plan is autistic spectrum disorder, and for those with SEN support, it is speech, language and communication needs. Next slide, please. So looking at a breakdown of those percentages, so basically 16.6% of all children and young people are identified as having a special educational need or disability. And the breakdown is that 10% of those are in special schools, 0.6% of those are in pupil referral units, 7% of those are in independent schools, which means at least 82% of all children and young people with SEND are in mainstream education. Next slide. This is quite an interesting table. It's not up to date, but the trajectory, I think, is probably pretty similar now. So the percentage of children and young people with SEND in primary school is always higher than in secondary. And as you can see, between 2010 and 2019, that kind of level of those with SEND in secondary is kind of lowered a little bit. That doesn't mean there aren't many children and young people with SEN in secondary, of course there are. But what it does mean is that often what can happen is that it's believed anyway that transition sometimes can be so hard, some children and young people with SEND or with barriers to learning, that they're not able to manage it, or that sometimes secondary schools aren't able to meet needs, so those children and young people have to find alternative provision or homeschooling or become out of education. Thank you. Next slide, please. I've put here SEN crisis Birmingham. There's been a SEN crisis in Birmingham in terms of getting EHCPs and diagnoses and support where needed. There's been sometimes years long waiting lists for some parents and families, and that's probably, it's a similar picture, I think, across the country. Another recent crisis, which is national, is there's a severe lack of teachers' assistants or one-to-ones to work with those with SEND. What's happening is that either there's just no one to fill that position, or people with very little experience are employed to do a job which is actually a highly skilled job. And somebody, you know, I've been an assistant in both mainstream and special schools, and I can tell you I didn't have any training at all for either of those, and pay is not good. So, you know, some people can actually earn more at the local supermarket than they can doing the job. I think it's just something to be mindful of. And again, just thinking about the importance of your job and the positive impact that you can have within the classroom. And I think music is one of those subjects where it's arguably easier to have everybody together. And in some other lessons, that's not so easy. So I think it's really, really key. I've referenced The Power of Music there, Susan Hallam. Many of you have probably read that, but there's a new edition out now if you're interested. Okay, next slide, please. So thinking about what's behind behaviour, access needs or barrier to learning. Again, this is quite Birmingham specific, but I thought it might be interesting to have an example. There's a high percentage of children and young people with a disability and EHCP in Birmingham than the national average, high levels of deprivation than the national average, more children in care, and also high levels of SEMH, or that social emotional mental health issues, among those with special educational needs and disabilities. And these kind of statistics, or this information, is pre-pandemic data, and as you probably are all aware, the pandemic had a disproportionate impact on those with disabilities and vulnerabilities. So I imagine those numbers are much higher, and you know, there's far more children and young people with those kind of difficulties now. I just think it's worth thinking about, again, what might be behind behaviour, what might be behind certain access needs or barriers to learning, and how can we help. And again, the impact of music specifically on this cohort, I think, can never be kind of underestimated. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I like to kind of frame or always think about the social model in every area of what I do. Some of you may be aware of the social model. It's a model that was created for disabled people by disabled people. Next slide, please. There's a great video on the Scope website, if any of you got a few minutes, about 5 minutes long. It's a really nice summing up of the social model. But essentially what the social model states is that it's society that disables people, not their impairment. Oh, thank you. Someone to put that in the chat. So basically, for example, if you're in a wheelchair and you can't access a building, it's not the fact that you're unable to walk that's the problem. The problem is that a ramp hasn't been made available to you. And sometimes I think it's easier to think about how we can remove barriers for those with physical disabilities than it is for more hidden disabilities. So those who may have autism, for example, or may have a mental health issue that's disabling. But of course, all of these disabilities are equally important, and we need to make sure that we're addressing those with all the children and young people in our class. Something I think that both me and Margaret will reiterate throughout this is that just really it's about knowing our pupils as well as we can, and just remembering that it's our responsibility to make our lessons as accessible and inclusive as possible. What else I love about the social model is that the ethos can be used for any kind of difference. So for example, if you have students who have English as an additional language, for example, again, it's still your responsibility to or our responsibility to make sure our lessons are as accessible as possible for them. Thank you. Next slide, please. So I suppose throughout this, and thinking about your planning as well, what's the best approach or technique to use when working with those with barriers to learning, or how can you plan for those with barriers to learning? Next slide, please. The golden rules. So the first golden rule is there are no golden rules, which seems probably counterintuitive. I guess what I mean by that is that we need to have a child-centered approach. And again, so important when planning. So when thinking about, the cohorts that you're working with, it's so important to have as much information as possible from previous teachers, from parents, from SENCOs, from therapists, whoever, is in the child's life. Because you need to understand what's happening in the room, you need to understand the barriers that children and young people have, and also the motivations that young people have. However, having that information, it's also important not to have expectations necessarily of skill level or ability, because I think it's important to just let them show you actually what their skill level is. Thank you. Next slide, please. I think one of the key things for us as a service, and one of the key things I'd like you to take away from anything else from this, is the importance of starting with the child or the children with the most complex barriers to learning and planning from there, because that's the way to really be truly inclusive. And this could mean anything. This list is non-exhaustive here about how you can do that or what you need to think about, but really the idea of championing that, or advocating for the children and young people who have the most complex barriers, and thinking about what that might mean in your classroom, for example. Do you have children and young people who might have sensory impairments? Do lights need to be dimmed? Do there needs to be an area where people can have time out? Do you need any, do anything people, might they need Braille, or might they need PECs, which is picture exchange systems, or visual timetables to help them access the lesson? In a more broader sense, thinking about progression routes, might there be alternative progression routes that some children and young people could access, or performance opportunities as well, making sure they're fully accessible. I've put OMI there. I was going to talk about OMI later, but I'll mention them now. OMI, the One-Handed Musical Instrument Trust. I think somebody will provide a link for them as well. They're an incredible organisation that work tirelessly to adapt conventional instruments for children and young people. So if somebody's desperate, for example, to play a violin, but they might have can only use one hand, they'll do everything they can to make sure that it can find an adapted instrument. They use technology as well, but the unique thing about OMI is that they do their best to adapt to traditional instruments, because the conversation about instruments, I think, is really important, about not assuming what best instrument it is for that child or young person to play, or thinking about which instruments motivate children and young people, but also being aware of what might be overwhelming as well for others. Thank you. Next slide, please. I know Margaret's going to be talking quite a bit about this as well, so really just a brief thing from me on youth voice and the child-led approach. But I really like this quote from Adam Ockleford, who says that the most potent, powerful force is a child's motivation, and that if you show them you're prepared to walk their musical journey, they'll be happy and thrilled to engage with you. So the big message there, I guess, is that it's so important to get to know what, and it sounds obvious, but it's so important to get to know what the children love, what really gets them going, and that will help so much with engagement and so much with progress, and also removing barriers. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, I think we don't need to go through this slide really in any detail. We've talked already about getting information, yeah. And we talked a bit already as well about environment. So here are just some of the examples of things you might need to do, again, non-exhaustive. Thank you. So I think thinking, this isn't actually specifically an environment comment, this first one, but just thinking about removing barriers. So if you do that, it may be that once you've made these tweaks, or you've planned bearing this in mind, you might not have to adapt anything else. So I think one of the biggest anxieties sometimes about inclusion and about, for example, starting with those with the most complex needs is that people worry that the quality or the skill or ability level for the rest of the group might change. But I think that the thing is that if you're successfully removing barriers, then everybody's on an even playing field. So that shouldn't be, you know, an issue at all. Thank you. Next slide, please. So yeah, just a little word about instruments or technology. I mean, you'll probably know lots of things about this as well, but there's just some great apps out there that you can use, accessible apps for those who might have limited mobility, or even just, you know, if you wanted to try something a bit different, there's some really nice apps there. Clarion is an incredible app that's going to be released in September, and I think it's probably one of the few bits of music technology that you can play expressively. It was created by Open Orchestras, which I think there's going to be a link to in the chat later anyway, but it's, look out for it, because it will be an incredible addition to your canon of instruments, I think. And when using iPads, if you want to as a instrument, great to use things like mini rig speakers to really amplify that sound. We've talked about OMI as well, and obviously, yeah, the conversation about choice of instrument. Thank you. I didn't want to leave the session today without talking about the Sounds of Intent and Trinity accreditation route. Some of you may be aware of this. It's a route that's been created obviously by Trinity in partnership with Sounds of Intent. Sounds of Intent is a music developmental framework that was designed specifically for those with severe and profound multiple learning difficulties. But there's now a suite of exams that can be taken by anybody at all. They're fully inclusive, so there's no limit on, you know, there's no limit on genre or on instrument, and basically what happens is you just send in videos of children and young people playing at certain levels in certain domains, and then Trinity moderate it, and then you can get the certificate. So it was originally designed for those with severe and profound multiple learning disabilities, but actually it's for anybody at all who can't access the more conventional exam routes, and it goes up to level 6, which is being a highly skilled musician. So if there's any of students that you might have, you know, who this might be appropriate for, please do look it up. It was launched in September. So yeah, it's an exciting new development. Thank you. Talked about OMI. Direct Music are, I think, England's and Scotland's leading charity for disabled musicians, and it's led by disabled musicians. So if you're interested, do look Drake Music up as well. Thank you. Next slide. Next slide. We don't pick that one. Thank you. So just thinking about hub work and us as a hub. So, you know, it's our job as a music hub to providing music education, or to help support schools to provide music education for every child. Next slide, please. And as you've probably read in the national plan, inclusion is one of the 5 main strategic functions, as I said. It also is partnership and schools. And I think there's a real onus on making, for us as hubs, to make stronger partnerships with schools and more meaningful partnerships with schools, and that it's kind of a two-way process, or a two-way as well, kind of CPD thing. But I think particularly with the plans, you can absolutely go to your hub and ask for support with these plans. Next slide, please. We're kind of at the beginning of that journey, to be honest. We have a working group that's met once, and it's made up of primary, secondary and special school teachers across Birmingham, music leads in each, who've kind of discussed the potential of having a template. Some have said a template may not be the most appropriate thing, but that conversation has begun basically, and it will continue. But yeah, different hubs might be doing different things, but it's definitely do go to your hub. So to finish, I guess just to talk through the 2 key inclusion principles would be good. So the first is that we're all teachers of SEND, and we're all inclusive practitioners. There will be children and young people in your lessons who have, for example, experienced trauma, who are diverse in terms of background, culture, and also those with disabilities. And the next one is, yeah, again, start with the learners with the most complex barriers to learning and plan from there. Yeah, we don't need to go through all of this, but I think the bottom point I think is really important, which is just about what we can all gain from inclusion. And I often quote Joanna Grace, who put something on social media the other day. Joanna Grace is an incredible ambassador for inclusion. on many, many different levels. But she wrote something about how including people should be like adding squash to water. It changes everything for everyone. And I think that's the key thing. And for me, for everybody, it's a positive thing, a positive change. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Don't look at that one. Another really nice quote, this is from Adam Ockleford again, just about how he's worked for the past 40 plus years in music making with those with additional needs, particularly those with autism spectrum disorder. But he just talks about how that work has really helped him to understand how so-called neurotypical people, so how those who are not autistic, create, process and respond to music. So it's taught him so much about just humans and how we all respond to music. And next slide, please. And again, yeah, there's Joanna Grace's, again, she did a great TED talk, if you're interested, called Inclusion for Pity's Sake. But she says arguments for inclusion should be based on gain and not pity, and that's absolutely how I feel about it as well. Excellent. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. That's fine, we don't need to go through that one. So yeah, so that's kind of a whistle-stop tour, I guess, of inclusion, but I hope you found some of that useful. Obviously, we can discuss any questions you might have now, and then I think all of these links hopefully will be found either in the chat or in the email that you'll get following this session. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about music development plans and to think about how we might start crafting ours. Thank you so much, Sophie. It's so helpful to start our thinking by being incredibly rooted in the children and young people that we serve as teachers. I think that as musicians and music teachers, we are deeply committed to enabling our pupils to enjoy a life enriched by music, with whatever that might look like for them, but still in the kind of busy school day, we can be drawn away by other priorities. And certainly when somebody says to us, you need to go and write a plan, you need to publish it, you need to do a progression strategy, sometimes by accident we can kind of become unrooted or untethered, and it's just so helpful today to have that grounding really firmly and front and centered with our pupils and their various needs, which we know are extremely wide-reaching. As Ruth said, my name is Margaret. I lead music and lots of other things, but primarily music. I'm a music teacher and a musician, and I always will be for art schools. We are a network of 41 schools serving just under 30,000 pupils, and we work exclusively in areas of deprivation and disadvantage. And music is a really big part of life in our schools, but each one of them is extremely different. And at this point, we are starting to think and starting to navigate this world of music development plans. Amongst our network, it's really important to us that each school is writing their own plan in a way which best meets them and best serves the needs of the children in their school, for lots of the reasons that Sophie mentioned. What I'm going to do this evening is just share a little bit about our process, and hopefully some useful tips and tricks that we've picked up along the way and things that might be helpful for you as you start to undertake this process. Before I go any further, I'm really conscious that there are people of all different backgrounds and in all kinds of schools, and some people from non-formal settings and various other things on this call. I hope that you will find something useful for you. But if there's anything that I can clarify or anything that you'd like us to come back to or to explore more, please do put it in the chat or ask a question, and we will be sure to make time for that at the end. So I thought it would be really helpful to, because if you're like me, you probably read a lot, don't have a lot of time, but do like to read things, see lots of sound bites on Twitter, see lots of different people's opinions. And actually, what I think is really helpful is to go back to the actual document itself and see what does the plan say about music development plans. I found I was getting, excuse me, a little bit lost in all of the noise. And so helpfully, I just went back to the document itself and tried to pick out what I felt the key things were for me in my context as a teacher and somebody who works directly with and in schools. And so the first sentence is a long one, and I'm going to give you just 10 seconds to read that now. So I guess when I read that, I think, well, that sounds really like what my departmental development plan looks like already. And I feel a little bit of comfort in that, thinking, okay, maybe this isn't a massive step that I need to get to. That sounds like familiar language, things that I'm used to. I have a vague sense of, or have a good sense of what the process to writing one of those is. And hopefully we'll have, as I say, don't feel quite so daunted by new language. And I think that's one of the key messages. As I read through the plan, I'm brought back consistently to this idea that schools should be doing what is the right thing for them and for their pupils. As we said, as Ruth said at the beginning, at the outset, there is no format that we have been asked to write a plan in. We haven't been asked to reference really specific things, ways of doing things, types of curricula, skills versus knowledge. We've just been asked to create one source that will help us and guide us in our practice. And I think that's something to hold on to throughout. The second thing is we'd like to see every school drawing out their subject-specific approach in a music development plan. If you're like me, you've been working in schools for nearly 20 years now, and actually clear and in writing that the department would like us to have a subject-specific, so a music-specific approach is really helpful. And I hope that you will take strength from that too. And finally, that all schools should produce a music development plan in a form that works for them. So again, there is no template coming from DFE. There is no format that they're looking for specifically. We should do what works for us. Next slide, please. And so what is it saying? It also says, though, that the DFE have clear expectations of what they want to see in time. It gives us a list of things that they've spotted, that they've noticed, that schools who have really great provision are doing, and it would like all of us to be able to ensure that those things are accessible for our pupils. The list is, as you have on this slide, and I'll give you a second to read it. I hope that as you read that list, there is nothing in there that feels problematic. There's nothing that, as a musician and a music teacher, there's nothing in there that feels like, I really don't want to do that, really don't see the place of that in my department. You might, however, be thinking, I just would love to do that, but X and Y barriers really in my way in being able to do that. They're two different things, and let's just kind of take a second to recognize that and be able to detach the two things. So as I say, I would hope that as a music teacher, all of these things are kind of what you would agree are fairly basic entitlements for a thriving secondary school or an all-through school. Next slide, please. There's also really clear reference to the work of Hampshire County Council's music service, led by Kevin Rogers, around the three areas of kind of common features of excellent provision. We've got our curriculum, we've got our instrumental and vocal provision, our lessons, our ensembles, and then all of our events, our opportunities, the things that make music really special. I guess you might put your own performances and various other things in there. And so what would be great is, this might be new to some people. I would really recommend this diagram as a helpful tool to articulate provision. As I say, I think that the work that Kevin and the team in Hampshire did is really in depth, and they have so much research that I'm sure that they would happily share about these being really common features of excellent provision across all of music education, but certainly in our secondary schools. Next slide, please. And so there's also a really clear vision coming through this document. It's an updated one from the first plan, and it's to enable all children and young people to learn to sing, play an instrument, and create music together, and have the opportunity to progress their musical interests, including professionally. So as you sit here today in your busy music department, or in your hub office, or wherever your home office may be, different words in that are going to stand out to you. For me, there's something about all children and young people. I'm sure Sophie would be feeling that very strongly. the fact that creating is in there in the first sentence of the vision statement is massive. It's a huge jump forward for us. And progress is a really big thing for that I see coming through here. We know that traditionally there has been, in some places, lots of activities happening and not the most joined up approach to that over time. And actually, when we have pupils with us in our secondary schools for 3, 5, 7 years, it's really important that they make progress over that time, just like they would in anything else. And I think, again, in this, and of course, the reference to making music professionally. So I would feel that that is probably a hint towards looking outwards beyond our schools. Next slide, please. To sit underneath the vision are 3 goals, so that there is high quality music education in the early years. So a really welcomed, wonderful mention for our early years colleagues here, first line of the goals. Those of us who are working in all through schools, don't forget, your responsibility is very firmly all the way through your school if you are the head or the director of music in that school. And so you need to be including your early years colleagues, so working from the early years right up. That all music educators were working in partnership, and that with children and young people's needs and their interest at the heart of what we do. There is no space to be putting our business interests first, our various other goals that we might have. We're clearly being told that children and young people's needs and interests need to drive provision. And finally, that those children that we have in our departments that we know are really interested, are really committed, are immersed in music, have the opportunity to make progress and to make music with others, and to pursue a career in music if that's something they should like to do. So that's what it all says. Kind of lots of information, lots of stuff in there. What do you do with it all? I would say get it out of your head, plan your vision, listen, learn, and then plan and make it happen. And so I'm going to walk you through some steps that you might take to go through that process. Step number 1, getting it all out of your head. You might be the most organized, wonderfully diligent record keeper. You might have every score in perfect order in your music department. I am not one of those people. I and some other people I know, I hope I'm not alone, I'm probably a repository of lots of information that is in my head, and lots of ways of doing things. I've inherited departments who have ways of doing things that have emerged over time and developed over time that are wonderful. I can't find a reason for why they do those things. And so I would say the first step is to get everything out of your head, down on paper in whatever form works for you. You might be a spreadsheet person, you might be a spider diagram person, you might be a voicey person, it doesn't matter. But just try and gather all of the information about what you are doing now, what's going on in your department, any legacy information that might be helpful to you in one place. Take time, read through it and sift through it. Next slide, please. When you have anchored yourself in that and have kind of refreshed your thinking about why you do things, why on earth do we do this is at a certain time? I know that we've made that decision for a reason, but I can't remember why we do it. You've kind of remembered all of these things. You've got them all in one place. It's time to start listening. And this is something that is essential in any planning process, particularly if you're going to undertake a piece of work like this. Children and young people's interests and music making in general is such a broad and personal thing, and we have the great honor of being able to consult with them, to respect them, to uplift the musics of their communities, of their families, of their religions, of their faiths, their traditions in our music department, to legitimize them often, and to support them to develop. And so listening to our young people has got to be one of the first things you do. I've got a list of questions here, and I'm sure we can share the slides afterwards for you to ask your pupils, but certainly in my setting, this is something that we have regularly built into our Key Stage 3 lessons. We have it built into our assessment cycles, and we will do our best to include in tutor time so that there's a slightly more less connected person to music asking similar questions, so we can get a really good sense of where our pupils are at with music. We also talk to their adults and what do they want from music, and that's probably really you don't know what you're going to get back in that. You can get lots of wonderful surprises and you can get some nasty shocks too, but it's really important to ask the question. It's really important to ask your parents, what do you expect from us as a school? And it's really important to be sharing that with your principal and your SLT as part of this process. Your hub, Sophie is working with the wonderful hub, and there are lots like them. They're particularly wonderful, but there are lots like them around the country, and they're willing, they're ready, they're able to talk to you. They're also going through this process, and they're going through lots of other difficult change at the moment, and so their answer might be, we don't know yet. But you need to ask the question, because it's their job to support, it's their job to support our pupils, and it's their job to support you too. And so, excuse me, it's absolutely vital that we take responsibility and ownership of holding that relationship, of opening the doors, and establishing a connection with our local authority. And then finally, not finally, I'm sure there are lots of different people and other people you could consult. You need to talk to your MAT sponsor. If you are in a MAT like mine, you probably will have a music lead or a lead teacher for music, maybe one teacher from your school who is taking on more of a kind of strategic role across the network. Again, reach out to them and ask them questions. What are we doing about our strategy? What's your role? Where's the role of our academy? Where are we going to prioritize music? Where does it sit within the 5-year plan? And how can you help me advocate for our subject? Next slide. Excuse me, I'm just going to have to cough for 1 second. Me. Okay. So you've got everything kind of that's out of your head on paper. You've got a heap of qualitative and information from lots of different stakeholders in your community. The next thing you want to do is to sit with your team, not alone, and plan what is your vision and what is your intent. If you've been through kind of any Ofsted prep recently, you probably have been doing this as part of that preparation, but there is no harm at all in doing it again. I would say at this point, it's really important to involve your principal and your senior leadership team. No music development plan should be written in isolation. It's too big a job. It involves too many different people in your school community and beyond. And also, realistically, there is going to be a significant financial ask at the end of it. And so it's your job as a head of department to bring your head teacher along with you and to support them to see what you see in your subject, to support them with the data, to see why this is so good for our pupils, why they love it, why we should be investing in it, and also to agree with you what the next steps should be for your provision. Also, music is one of our great connectors. And the amount of times I have had the most human conversations with principals who seem inhuman at times, and I don't mean inhumane, just they can be superhuman, I think, about a piece of music or about kind of their experience of music. That's such a gift that we have as music teachers, to be able to connect with people of all types on that level. And it's really important that we include them in this process. Next slide, please. When you've got your vision set out, and you could be dreaming big, why not? The world is your oyster. It's then probably time to reflect on what you're doing already and see how far away you are, where are you going, how are you going to get there? There are lots of different tools to help you with that reflection. You might have one in school already. You might have a really great coaching system, really great reflection tools. There are, as I say, lots of different processes for doing it, but I wanted to give a shout out to 2 things. Once again, to this wheel that you see on the slide in front of you, and then on the next page to the Can Do Music partnership, which is Musicmark, Music Teachers Association and ISM, and they have developed a fantastic reflection tool, partly using the Jubilee Centre's character development framework, which lots of you will know from personal development work in your schools. I would imagine lots of your schools are using it already. And so they have applied it to music and can give a really helpful progressive reflection for you to map your provision against. All of these things are just starting points. You will, again, you know more about your school, you know more about your context than anybody else. These are just tools to help you. And finally is to plan. And this is where you need real discipline, where you need structures, where you need systems, and you probably need a critical friend. So you probably need somebody, maybe you've got a friend who's a head of art or drama, maybe your principal could be that for you, or maybe you have, you're in a MAT and you've got a secondary network, you're in a really vibrant hub where you've got a secondary network, or you just have a friend who's a music teacher and you do these things all the time. But you need to plan what you're going to do. You need to plan where you're going to be in 3 years, and principals will be really grateful for that, because they like to be able to plan for those lengths of time, and likely that your academy or school development plan or improvement plan probably reaches at least 3 years down the line. They would like to be able to see where music sits alongside that. You need to know what resource do we need then? What are we going to need next September, the September after that? And of course, to be able to work with your finance team to see what the ask is in that. And then how are we going to evaluate it? How are we going to know we're doing it really well? Really tricky in lots of different ways, because we know that assessment, traditional assessment, summative assessment is just one way. And we also know that not everybody who's a great musician is going to do Key Stage 4 music, and that's fine. But there will be metrics that you want to bring in place and that you want to put in place and hold yourself to account over. So this is the point where you need to be doing that. What does success look like for you? And then finally, one for you as a head of music or a head of department is, how do we keep everybody bought into this? It's really easy to start something and it's really hard to sustain it, especially to sustain it over time. And again, a lot of us in our music departments are kind of away in our music departments, which might not even be in the same building as everybody else, working away on things. And so as part of this planning cycle, you need to be planning in what your reporting is. What's your reporting to senior leaders? What's your reporting to your LGB? What's your concert cycle? When are you going to do a staff inset or a staff update as part of one of your standing briefings or something like that? But again, agreeing with your SLT now that it's really important that we are committing to this as a whole school, and this is what we'll need to make it happen. So final thoughts should be, I think, on the slide in front of you. Make sure that pupils and their progress and the quality of their experience is central to every discussion that you have. Take small steps and they will take you great places. Partnership is absolutely vital. Get onto your hub, get onto charities, get onto your mat. And finally, this is such an opportunity. We're really lucky, I think, in music that we have the eye of so many different people. I'm sure that lots of our colleagues in other subjects would really love it. Obviously, it comes with great responsibility and it comes with some work. Not going to deny that at all. But it is an opportunity, and I feel that we should lean into it. And that's where I'm going to wrap up and open for any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Margaret, and thank you, Sophie, for those fantastic presentations. That was really informative and has certainly given us a lot of food for thought. We do have some questions, some of which have been submitted in advance of this session. So somebody asked, how would you go about integrating extracurricular and curricular work in your development plan? I know we've touched on that a little bit, but could you maybe expand on that one, please?
I think that it is up to you to decide how you see them, to be honest, and then to find a way to reference them in your plan. And I guess that is the challenge of this work, is to articulate what is so often in our heads. I would start really simply, maybe would start by writing what you're doing. And maybe you want to do, or maybe you could take each of the different kind of steps around in the classroom, around enrichment, list what you're doing under those things, and maybe make connections between them. But ultimately, I think that is up to you to do in a way that works for you, and in a way that you understand and communicate to others. I don't think there is one right or wrong way of doing it. And that sounds like a bit of a woolly answer, but I think it is going to be different for everybody how you would do that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, just from a hub point of view, often there are many extracurricular opportunities that you could potentially access from your hub if you're not already. So again, go out to the hubs, see how we work together, and put those in your plan. Absolutely, what we can offer in an extracurricular sense.
Thank you. And we also had more a comment really than a question in the Q&A. Somebody said basic entitlements, yes, but how many maths teachers will be required to list their extracurricular activities? I think
a maths teacher, maths department, certainly in the schools I've worked in, were to list their extracurricular activities, they'd be pretty short. I think the job is kind of different in music, and I think that most SLT recognise that the expectations of a music teacher is to work across curriculum, enrichment, and performance. And it's true, they wouldn't be yet asked to do that. They might be. In our trust, we are actually about to take on a huge kind of enrichment project around maths. So, watch this space. Maybe they will have to in time. But I think they're probably fundamentally different in their subject, in their disciplines, from my perspective anyway.
Okay, thank you.
A note on just cross-curricular, this probably won't apply to many people on the call. I don't know if we have any people from special schools here, but obviously music is one of the subjects, certainly in special school settings, that can be cross-curricular as well. So that, I don't know if that would be expected in a development plan, but I imagine lots of special school music teachers will be putting that in their development plans, and should be putting that in their development plans also.
Thank you. Someone said anything in a development plan could be assessed as part of performance management. So why would teachers list extracurricular activity, as they don't have control of who might participate, who may or may not participate? Any thoughts on that?
Because they wouldn't have control over who participates in the enrichment.
Yeah, I guess if you're listing extracurricular activity on your plan, sure. I guess I don't know if they're asking whether you sort of held up accountable for that, and then people may not participate in those things that you've listed, but absolutely.
So I guess the thing, and that is why I was trying to stress so clearly from the beginning, that this is not a job for a head of music. This is a job for a head of music plus an SLT, it's plus your hub, and why it is so important to agree what the accountability is in the process of planning. You're absolutely right. You can't necessarily be assessed for what you have no control over, but what you do have control over is a relationship with an enrichment lead, is being clear about what goes into the plan, and control over agreeing kind of things now at this point. And so I would always say to teachers to be really proactive about that. I also think that you can push, there's lots of ways to push back, but what you want to be doing is working within the system of your school. And so control the things that you can control, and actually you might find that there's a lot more than you thought there might be. I feel like I hear quite a lot of anxiety in that question about performance management. And so again, that's a conversation to have with your line managers, and it is, look, if I do this thing, my inclination at the moment isn't, because I feel I'm going to be assessed against something that I have no control over. Can we work on that together? Obviously that's an optimal situation, but again, like I say, I feel very, very strongly that this is not just the job of a head of music or a head of faculty, that it has to be a whole school. And I think that DFE have said that from the outset around the school improvement planning and how this needs to fit within that. So that would be my advice there, is don't get stuck if you can at all with something that doesn't work for you. Yeah, Sophie, I don't know, from a hub perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just agree with everything you said, really. I think that, you know, as I said previously, some of the extracurricular work may well be, you know, in partnership with a hub, or even just the children attend and you're not there, and it's, you know, not to do with you specifically as the head of music. So I guess, yeah, that whole idea of partnership working, as you said, and including the hub within that, I think is just so important, and there's a particular emphasis on that in the plan as well. And I think it's a positive thing, but it might be a new thing as well to some teachers. And yeah, just important to embrace that, I think, and get the positives out of those partnerships.
Thank you. There's been a comment from Stuart Burney from Services for Education in Birmingham, who has thanked you both and said that, as Sophie said, we've created a working group of teachers and schools to help drive the music development planning process. And he feels that the Birmingham hub support will mainly be for those in primary schools, because, as we know, music coordinators are not necessarily musically trained in primary schools. And that their thought is a plan for these settings should be for 2023-24, as mentioned by the Arts Council, and that they'll be offering all of their schools a section to drop into their plan from the music service partners that focuses on in-school / extracurricular and partnerships and progression. So that sounds like really supportive help from Services for Education there, and I think lots of other hubs will be or are already doing the same. I don't know if you know of any other examples, but I think, you know, we kind of said it loud and clear: do speak to your hub, do reach out to your hub as part of this process.
Absolutely. And if you are in a situation where, and I think, you know, Stuart's absolutely right, we saw a lot of that in the primary webinar on Tuesday, of primary non-specialist teachers being in a panic and really looking for very specific support. But as secondary teachers, we also have ISM, we have music teachers, we have Music Mark, and say hopefully you have a network of people maybe that you trained with, maybe that people are in surrounding schools to you that you can reach out to as a specialist teacher, and say be a critical friend for each other, and people working in similar contexts for you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, the ISM has, for example, our community Facebook group. So, you know, feel free if you're an ISM member to discuss your music development planning process with other members in that forum. You know, social media is a great place for sharing ideas and forming communities. We did have a question about Ofsted in advance. Somebody asked, how can we tie our development planning with what Ofsted are looking for?
So I am not a believer in having lots of documents rolling around, as I say. I'm not. Some people are well able to organize their lives and keep on top of loads of different things. I'm definitely not one of them. And so whatever you are writing in this plan has got to be multi-purpose. There is no point in having duplicate documentation which only seeks to confuse you, your SLT, and most importantly, your pupils and your community. Anything that you write in this plan should be fit for purpose for Ofsted. I'm trying to think about what wouldn't be in there, and I'm not sure I know in Titan. I guess the detail of your curriculum, the real kind of maybe that progression strategy that is mentioned in the plan might be something that Ofsted would be particularly interested in, your curriculum map, that level of detail. But this, I think, should sit on top of that rather than alongside it. When Ofsted come to your school, you are showing off what you do. That is not just one narrow view of what that is, which is at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in a Pachelbel's canon or djembe lesson. That is the whole range of what your school offers in music. So that is curriculum, that is instrumental lessons, all the things that we've already talked about. And so having all of that together in one place can only be a helpful thing. Obviously, their job is to check that you're doing those things, that you're doing what you said you'll do, and that all the dots join together, and that children kind of are able to do, and they're able to show or know all the things that your plan sets out for them. But there is no point in having multiple documentation sitting around, because that just makes it redundant for everybody. Ofsted also want to know that you're meeting the needs of your pupils. And again, any good music development plan should have that front and center already. How are you targeting your approach? How are you making adaptations, whether that is through technology or instruments, or just making adaptations for pupils in the room? And so in my sense is that your music development plan is kind of your umbrella document. You might have your curriculum, knowledge, skills, whatever it is that you have and whatever format that you present that in. But when Ofsted come knocking, your job is to show them what you do. And that is not restricted to one document or another. That is the full breadth of the offer for your pupils in your school.
Great. Thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time. So thank you very much to both Margaret and to Sophie for your presentations today. They were very supportive and empowering, I think, and hopefully you feel more confident to write your music development plan following today's webinar. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. And please do fill in our post-webinar survey, which you can find in the chat, and we'll also be emailing out to you. We do really appreciate your feedback, and it helps us to improve our services and to offer more free professional development through the ISM Trust. So please do fill in that feedback form. As we said, the webinar recording will be sent out to everyone who registered by email, and it will be available to watch back on our website for free. And we'll also send you all of the useful links that we've shared today during this webinar, plus some information about other upcoming webinars that we have, including our free primary singing toolkit webinar, which is taking place on Thursday, the 23rd of March at the same time, 4 p.m. And ISM members can also sign up to our webinar on hearing health for musicians on Thursday, the 27th of April. So finally, it just leaves me to say thank you very much again for watching, and we hope to see you at another ISM Trust event soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.